Okay, welcome everybody. We're making a slightly late start, but you are attending Open Education in a bricks and mortar institution with two speakers today. We have Stephen Carey, Professor at the University of British Columbia. Stephen harks way back to 1996, introducing WebCT to University of British Columbia at the time.
Exactly. First course, in fact.
Since producing dozens of masters and doctoral theses about online learning, since then has produced dozens of masters and doctoral theses about online learning. Since 2002, researching credit-based online courses that benefit from pan-university participation between students and faculty. Speaking of which, Tannis was a student of one of those projects. Tannis is an instructional developer at the Learning and Teaching Centre of the British Columbia Institute of Technology. Currently doing a PhD, or finished a PhD? Finished a PhD in language and literacy education focused on online international education. Say again, language and literacy, is that correct so far? Yep. Researcher on digital learning, digital learner. Now I'm not sure about the acronym here, BCIT/Concordia study. You'll introduce that in your talk? Oh, okay. So we'll just pretend we know that one. Okay. All right, so the presentation format is preceded by a brief presentation, followed by a dialogue between Stephen and Tannis. Did I say your name? Tannis Morgan? Yeah, Tannis. And open for any introductions from the audience. We'll proceed with that.
Sure. Okay, I thought I'd start out with this just giving some sort of background, and that is like I think the urgency need for more open learning. And it's very interesting. I've been in several sessions where people are thinking that open learning is, we've attained the level we're going to attain, which I think is absolutely the opposite. I think what's happening is that institutions such as UBC are really going to, in fact, have to have greater and greater open learning orientations, because it's simply a huge number of factors. One is that simply people have to spend so much of their life getting qualifications, certifications, that they simply can't do it all by being in an institution. They have to do it online. They have to do it through open learning. And it isn't even, this is going to increase. I mean, David Emerson, our past foreign minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, reckons that 2/3 to 3/4 of the graduates in the next few years will in fact require going back to university again to attain greater certification, greater levels of knowledge. And this is partly because the whole world, due to pandemics, due to the financial crisis, due to all of the global warming, all of these factors, that people simply will need a much, much greater level of education, and technical and science education in particular is what is stressed for the future if we're going to survive, and sort of some think it's already too late with regards to global warming, etc. But it's simply going to be a very, very different world, and simply the amount of global coordination is going to be unprecedented. Now, there's a huge problem with that for any learning at all. First of all, about 80% of the students in the world don't really have access to universities in any direct way. And if we look at the developing world, these are the countries we simply cannot allow to neglect. We simply cannot do that. You can't just say, well, I'm okay, Jack, the heck with them, because in fact we know from pandemics and we know from everything else that's going on in the world, global warming, that we are entirely dependent on their well-being. So it's a whole new era, a whole new ballgame, I think. And so this is where open learning is going to play a huge role. Now, in addition to geographic, economic isolation of the majority of the students in the world from institutions for a variety of reasons, there's also the huge factor of linguistic isolation. 90% of the publications in science journals in the world, more than 90%, in 1990, 90% of them were published in English. 80% of the world's population of students is not academically literate in English. I mean, the divide is absolutely huge, and no one has really addressed this that I know to a great extent in terms of open learning. Now, our speaker this morning, in talking with her, she is aware that even though countries like Tanzania went from an English-based situation 20 years ago or 30 years ago to a Swahili-based educational system, they've reversed that and they've gone back to English. And she feels, except for South Africa, that's the exception in Africa, that most of the countries have really accepted this, and education is in English. But many, many places in the world, that's not the case. Malaysia just went back. They had gone from Bahasa to English instruction. They now reversed that and gone back to Bahasa. Tanzania has changed to English. South Africa, I participated a bit on the making the language policy in South Africa 10 or 15 years ago. And, it's quite a difficult situation with 12 official languages. So, but her view is very, very enlightening. She felt it's just not viable, that if you're going to survive in this global world, you have to, in fact, have access to the leading scientific discoveries, the leading scientific literature, and you have to be able to publish at an academic level in these fields if you want to advance as an academic at all. John Flowerdew, in a very interesting book, if you're really interested in this topic, put out by the International Association of Applied Linguistics in 2007, cites these examples, gives actually examples of leading faculty members in China who cannot, in fact, be promoted because they can't publish in English. And we have a guest here from China. In fact, I was talking to him earlier today about this reality that if you're in China and you don't publish in English, you are simply not going to make it to the top. You know, a publication in English is worth 3 publications in Chinese at the University of Peking in Beijing. So this huge, huge linguistic barrier is a major problem. Now, several years ago at UBC, I put in an Asia-Pacific specialization, and in that course, we look at Asia-Pacific languages and cultures, and we were able to actually look at how we could increase the academic literacy in English of these students from Asia. Now, they could pass a TOEFL. They'd studied for many years to pass the TOEFL, but when it came to, in fact, writing in English at an academic level, it was a huge challenge. So we wanted to construct an online course that would deal with those issues and also be an online course for these people doing their master's and doctoral level studies. So we set up this course, and these students, and many of the students who had come from Asia were in my program at UBC, but many of their students obviously didn't have the financial resources to travel and pay tuition at UBC. And so we had students sign up from Beijing, from Japan, in one case also from Thailand. But we had these students at different universities. And the way this course was set up, and that's the model we'll be talking about today, is the model was set up so that they would be registered in their courses, their graduate courses in this first case, at these universities around the world. And the way you do this is you meet professors at a conference like this, and you could do that today. You could meet 3 or 4 people at different universities around the world, and they would stay registered in their home university. That's critical, because you'll never get through the bureaucracy at a university to get them entered through the TOEFL and all the rest into the universities in Canada. And they can't afford the tuition, the travel expense, the living expense, et cetera, et cetera. So the professors and the students in these different universities around the world sign up and register in this online forum. But they're getting credit for the course back at their institution. So you completely obviate the whole problem of entrance to UBC or entrance to having enough TOEFL, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the course is then run online, and you have a common list of readings, but they do all the critiquing of this from their home bases on this online forum. Now, the advantages of this are a few. One is the professors, who, as I mentioned before, are very eager to develop their academic literacy further because they, in fact, need this in order to be able to publish. And they have a tremendous difficulty in publishing, and they need to publish to get tenure to move up the ranks in any of these universities, just as we do here. So for the professors, it's a huge advantage. Plus, for the professors, it's an ongoing online conference, 3 weeks long, 6 weeks long, however long you want to make the course. For the students, of course, it's tremendous because you have a set of readings where various professors can contribute, and you can look at these various topics with people contributing with very different cultural and orientations and background and expertise. So it ends up being a very, very rich experience for the students and the teachers, much more than they would get by taking the course from me alone. So it's a huge benefit for their institutions, their faculty, and their graduate students. So that's one of the models that we've been interested in pursuing. Now, there are some limitations to this. It takes a tremendous amount of effort to set one of these up, but I'm sure you all have lots of friends at this conference that you could certainly set one of these courses up with the colleagues from other universities around the world. But it also depends on your clientele, on your students. As you know, if you read the Vancouver Sun yesterday, students in Vancouver and people in Vancouver in general are more internationally oriented and more globally aware than any other city in Canada and many cities in the United States. So Vancouver is a very good city to do this in because it's the doorway to Asia, and this is the Pacific century. So there's this huge amount of interest in what's going on in business and et cetera with these, for these students and their contribution. Oh, okay, now I think what I'll do right now is to see if that's clear at all and just open this up. And Candice, would you like to make a comment?
I think it might be a good idea for me to jump in and
Sure.
just sort of maybe go backwards a little bit.
Okay. But if you have any questions, just feel free because it is a different model. As far as I know, the first one was done in 2000. As far as I know, and I talked to David Wiley yesterday and a few other people, Stephen, and they don't know of anyone else who put in a course this early. This was done in 2000, the first one. So it was probably the first pan-university course where everyone got credit. And remember, credit is absolutely critical. Yes?
How would they get their home institutions to give them credit? Is that
Well, the students are registered in courses at these universities. This is a part of the course. And the professors can give 20%. I gave 30 or 40 in some courses where it was totally online. I gave 100% for their participation online. But that's a part of their course. And the professors in those institutions have control over what percentage they give for it. They do all the grading because their criteria and their local knowledge is quite different. So they get credit at their home institutions. Now, we've done, many people have done online courses, but it's very rare that they are accredited in such a way. And so the professors have control over that credit. So they don't lose any status either or control.
I'll
Yes.
be explaining this a little bit.
Yeah.
So you had to have a relationship with
Yes.
these professors?
Yes. That's why I was mentioning here, you might want to talk to some friends and set one of these up.
Maybe I'll just sort of jump in a little bit.
Sure.
Just
Tannis was in this course.
So Stephen has a good perspective on this because he represents, I guess, the ivory tower, and to some extent has had to work within that tower as a professor. Where I'm coming at this, my perspective is a little bit as a student participating in this, but also as an instructional developer, where my background is actually in distance education. So for me, I really see this as a convergence of the open access, the OER movement, and distance education. And what sort of intrigues me about this model that was being used at UBC is that it really is relevant to a lot of the current discussions that we're hearing today on open education resources. So specifically, really, our perspectives are that there is this convergence and that the OER movement really echoes many of the values that already exist in distance education around access, and in particular open education. I mean, open university systems were created in essence for to allow greater access to populations who weren't able to access the ivory tower. And really what we've observed is that the OER discussions for the most part have really been focusing on content and its distribution and how to sort of have equitable distribution and access to this content. And without sort of diminishing that, obviously that's really important. I certainly can echo that, perhaps content is infrastructure to a certain extent. But when we start looking at the greater systems at play here, it's clear that we have to move beyond these discussions of content and really start looking at pedagogically, how does this work within higher education? Now, there's obviously two views on this that I'm hearing here, and I'm sure there's many in between. It's a continuum, it's not one or the other necessarily. But really, do you work within the existing systems, or do you just work outside of them and create new systems? And for me, I mean, obviously there's value in creating new systems. That's what open universities, from what I understand in their history, those were new systems that were created to address a problem. But at the same time, I think we realize that institutions themselves as they exist, that there is a way to create models within existing institutions, and that's really the position we're adopting in this, in our model. So just to sort of do a little history lesson here, my background's in language and literacy education, and they often, about 30 years ago, I believe, they suffered the same sort of malaise with language education and university systems, and really questioned, what is this language education that we're doing currently in these universities? How can we sort of shift it to something a little bit more radical, I guess, a little bit, more effective? Again, it was the same sort of I think, commonalities with what we're talking about today in existing university systems. And this is a recognition from 1997, where they talk about self-access learning. And of course, in this open education resource discussions, I'm hearing a lot about self-directed learning, informal learning. How do we deal with that? How do we create systems that recognize informal learning? And what happened in language education is actually they did create a system. They created self-access centers within universities where students could create their own language programs, have access to all the resources that they needed, which in this case were, you know, paper type materials, books, cassette tapes, that sort of thing, because we were talking about 30 years ago. And this observation was made in 1997 that, you know, in fact, the traditional classroom could totally disappear, which is sort of interesting in the context of many of the discussions today. So really what we're saying is that if it can exist in the current institutions, where are we now? What does this look like? And right now what we've observed is that universities and higher education is really built on a very course-centric model, where we're talking about content, interactions, and assessed activities. And this is the unit that we're dealing with when we're talking about a university education model. Courses make up programs, etc. And these are these sort of chunks that we are applying credits to. And within this system, we recognize that universities have considerable social capital. I mean, they do provide something that many students need, and we recognize that. Students need credits. They need accreditation. Universities provide access to experts. And increasingly, especially in Canada, and this is well documented, internationalization is increasingly, I guess, adding to the capital of a university. So many of institutions in Canada now want to have an internationalization agenda because that adds to their social capital as an institution. So, so basically, but within this internationalization in some ways is problematic because there's a lot of barriers to this, and of course there's a lot of effort that goes to create joint programs, find ways of exchanging credits, Senate EDCO approvals, etc. But interestingly, these are actually quite different from a student perspective. From a student perspective, internationalization is a problem if you don't live in Canada, for example, or even if you do, cost, academic literacy, displacement to go attend the university, and language of instruction increasingly is a real issue. So, for example, the situation with TOEFL, I mean, most universities that I know of, including the one that I worked at in Mexico, required a TOEFL 550 to actually even enter the university. 550 is pretty high. And at the university I worked at in Mexico, their students actually had to get a TOEFL of 550 to even get their undergraduate degree from their own institutions. So these are insurmountable barriers. Well, they're not insurmountable, but they're incredible. They're immense. And of course, we have to remember that the majority of students in the world actually don't speak English as a first language. It's actually the minority. So the other idea with this, with the model, is that we're recognizing that while content is important, if we are really talking about a social constructivist ontological position, I guess, then content matters, but interactions, engagement with multiple perspectives is critical. And this is really where we think the problem is with the current system, is that we're in a system where the experts that we are attached to our institution, the students that we find ourselves in the classroom, constitute, you know, our community. And that increasingly it's important to sort of get past this, I guess, to get beyond this internal community and really get a broader access to a broader community. So I guess I'm going to borrow from Dave this morning, bring the context to the community. So what this means is that if you have international participation, if you can somehow allow it within the structure of your own institutions, there's a lot of expertise that exists outside of our own institutions. So how do we do this? What is one way that you can do this? And how do you sort of address any sort of the concerns of local and global knowledge? So in fact, what the model that I had up earlier here, this is really what it was trying to address. And in 2000, what this meant was we had asynchronous discussion forums set up where students interacted from these 3 different countries about global topics. And these students were registered at their own institutions. They had their own instructors. They were graded we basically took a component of each of their courses. So instead of taking the entire course as a unit, we took a component of the course, and we said this is the piece that we are going to break apart and allow international participation. And so the instructors graded their own students, but everybody was engaged in a common sort of space. And what this looks like perhaps in another context is, for example, I mean, I think really the professional health disciplines, for example, like medicine or dentistry. I worked at the Faculty of Dentistry for a while. And what this would mean there is they set up a lot of elaborate exchange programs with Vietnam, for example. But the Vietnamese students never ever came to UBC. And there was very few students that actually went to Vietnam to sort of, engage and learn from each other. So the local global exchange really wasn't, I don't think, from my perspective, happening, and it wasn't really enabled. But with a model that allows for a piece of that component to take place with global partners, preferably ones that are relevant to the discipline, there's a lot of potential there, and it's not just really about the discussion, but we have opportunities for case studies, problem-based learning, that sort of thing that can happen within a model where the course structure is broken apart. And still respect, of course, the local and global knowledge and allow an opportunity for that facilitation to take place. So I'm going to stop there because that was way over how long I should actually talk, I think. Is there any questions so far, or is there... Really, I think this is where it can go in any direction. There's more that we could talk about, but...
Perhaps you could revisit the question that was asked earlier, is how did you set up the relationships, we imagine, with the other institutions to formulate this?
Well, we've done different examples of this. Maybe you can talk about the Mexican one.
Yeah.
Which had Canada.
In Russia. And so in the case with Russia, Mexico, and Canada, I was working at an institution in Mexico, and I obviously had some connections with UBC. And there was a student at UBC who also had worked in a faculty in Russia, so it was in Siberia actually. And so we converged on this. We realized that our students weren't necessarily in the same disciplines, but there was some commonality, there was some benefit, some common ground that could be gained from a shared activity in this case. And so really it was conducted entirely, the organization took place entirely by email. We did have some access issues with Siberia. The students there, the cost of the internet was, quite, well, it was really high, and for them to go to an internet cafe cost a lot of money. So really they were dependent on their institutional systems, which were overloaded and busy. But at the same time, we were able to overcome that, and we were able to make it happen. And I think we did it with Russia several times, actually.
Yeah, actually we did, and one of the secrets of that was that I had another doctor, Tannis was in between degrees at that point. She had done a master's with me on autonomous learning or online learning of Spanish. Then she went to teach in Mexico with that, and while she was there, she ran this course. Another of my doctoral students was from Russia, and she was able to, in fact, convince her professor in Russia to get their class involved. Now, it's important to realize that what was so good for these different groups of students and their professors was that they were interested in Asia-Pacific cultures and languages, but some of the students were actually in international economics. Others were in international law, or they had that background. So they brought in an extremely rich set of prior knowledges to this discussion. So when we read an article, then we could discuss it from not only the different cultural points of view, but the different academic disciplines. Similarly, their professors were tremendously rich in their backgrounds, so the students had just a much, much more rich exposure than they would have if they had just taken the course from me. And that's very important to realize. So how you could set this up, as I say, you could meet someone here, our colleague from China, for example, or someone from Russia or whatever, and you could agree to, in fact, have an online forum in one of your graduate or undergraduate courses where the students would all enroll in their courses in their home universities, but participate together in this online asynchronous forum. And it would be a tremendous experience for them, but also one of the biggest features of these courses that I ran was that these were people who wanted to improve their English academic literacy. And by conversing in their disciplines about their specific knowledge, professional knowledge, English for special purposes, if you like, and talking about their research with other colleagues, they learned the particular genre of discussion, the technological vocabulary in English, and they were very appreciative. And the students, in fact, said they learned more English in this 6-week course than they had in 20 years in their home country, in some cases. But the professors similarly learned how to, in fact, write the technological language for academic publications. So is that clear how you would set it up if you wanted to? Because any of you, it's free, you know, no licensing. By the way, 0 licensing, cost nothing to run this course. I didn't have any grants or anything. Yes?
This may be a little off your subject, but along those lines, as an instructional designer, I understand your model. What I'm curious about is if you could speak briefly about the technologies you use.
Sure. Now, it's very interesting because Tannis did her doctoral thesis. Actually, this course led to 4 doctoral theses, which included the methodology of how it was run. But Tannis did a lot of research this and on other programs similar, and maybe you could comment on that.
Well, the technology in 2000 that we were using was WebCT, so it was being hosted by UBC. So and that was actually at no cost to UBC at the time. So it. We actually didn't even have an IT department. We had a research assistant who actually set up they had logins and passwords that were signed by the person at UBC, one of your students. So in that case, yes, there was a little bit of effort on the technology side, and of course, yes, it was free because it was being hosted by UBC. But at the same time, it was a mutually beneficial partnership too, because of course, the students in Russia didn't have access to WebCT, but of course, we don't really talk about the technology much because really, the sky is the limit now. In 2000, and for our purposes, we need a discussion forum. But really, the model itself lends itself to whatever can be used. It really depends on the context that you're working with. And of course, as we heard from Catherine this morning, obviously, this model might not work in areas in Africa where there's actually no internet at all. So there are limits to it. Yeah.
Okay, how actually do we do this?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of where I'm from, in America, which is a first world nation, we don't have an internet access problem, but we have our security things in place that, for example, would prevent us from having, people from Russia logging into our local systems. Our IT administrators block that wholesale.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't even allow people, even if they had internet access, to communicate with us directly. And so that does become an issue of, then what would we use?
You probably have to go outside of the institutional technologies because, well, not only that, institutions.
I had my own server. I bought my own server, and I, in fact, was running a course through there. It wasn't as elaborate as this, though. But this was all run through UBC server.
Well, I think. I just want to mention that one of the reasons this works is because we went totally outside the university system. We didn't go and get Senate and EDCO approval. We didn't have to because we took a course component. Had we took a course as a unit, we would have had to go through all kinds of bureaucracies between multiple institutions. There probably would have been ethical approvals, yada, yada, yada. So again, that's the idea of the model is that it has to be simple to function, and it has to be mutually beneficial.
Yeah, I have a question about open teaching. You referred to some of the open teaching courses.
Yeah.
Teaching course. I'm wondering if you're moving toward an open teaching model, or you've thought about that, where you're allowing participation from people who are not registered at whatever institution.
Well, you could do that, you see. It's very easy.
Well, we think this is open teaching because actually what happened is instead of having one professor expert from UBC, we had the expert also from Russia involved and the expert from Mexico or wherever. So instead of treating the one institution as having the expertise, it was much more, I think, democratic. And for me, that is open teaching. There was 3 experts, I guess, professorial experts anyways.
But everybody was coming through an institutional portal and registration.
Because the motivation for this was to make sure that students could get credits. Because again, it comes back to we recognize our position is that credits actually are really important. That students, this is currency for them in their home institutions when they go to work. Currency is not only English language acquisition and academic socialization in English, but it is also the credits that the institution provides. they need that credit. So unless, if you don't sort of have that position, then yes, you can do all kinds of other things. But that is a position we're coming from.
And in my earlier reference to pandemics, where you'll have to have courses like this, which can start like that, and in fact can train nurses and medical people, doctors, about the latest variation mutant of a virus, you'll have to have these courses, but they will want credit because when they go to practice in a clinic, the clinic's going to say, what's your credential? You can't say, oh, I signed up for this thing and had a good time. You've got to have a degree under a course number with a grade on it from a medical school, and you would have these around the world doing it, participating in this. And I see a much, much greater need for this now than ever, because look, if you look at global warming and what's happening, you're going to have a very ecology of knowledge model where what happens in Thailand is totally different than what happens in Toronto. So you have to have all this local expertise which contribute to the global expertise, but everyone's going to want credit. It's just going to be there. And I know yesterday in David and Stephen's debate, they were going to get to accreditation, but we never got around to it. But I would like to see more of that at this conference. I think we sometimes neglect to realize how much people need credit, how much they want it. I mean, if you're building your own house, you don't need the journeyman's paper. But if you want to go out and work for a union or get home insurance, you have to have those papers. If you want to do plumbing, gas fitting, anything, not just academia, right?
There's a question from Michael, and just before, there is a presentation by me tomorrow about accreditation.
Good.
For the Open Academy. Yeah.
Great.
Comment actually on your line of topic here, the one in front of me. I've run a course with people in Asia as well, and people here simultaneously, and we just used a really simple Google and Skype, and it was
Your own, not your institution.
yeah.
Likewise, I use Google
thing
Groups.
hosting just
Yeah.
something virtual, approaching nothing.
And you just cop the flack from the IT, what they're only got words.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting when you mention the cost because, you know, this didn't cost a penny, just my time, a lot of time. But, you know, the university doesn't like that, not because it was done, because they would like you to get a big grant to do this. Because, you know, they need money, right? The university is a business, right? So you don't get an extra reward for doing it for not spending money. You'd be penalized.
We have just over 5 minutes, 7 minutes precisely. More questions? I had a question about the accreditation. So I imagine different jurisdictions have different senses of value. So somebody maybe in Siberia might value a certificate or accreditation from UBC more than they do in their own institution. I have experience with a student in Pakistan who values the accreditation that my institution offers because none of the Commonwealth countries unfortunately recognise degrees and certificates out of Pakistan.
Yeah. Well, in fact, the Russian student had come to UBC to get her PhD from UBC, which she did, and she had come from Russia because she felt it was more prestigious to get the degree from...
So did you get to anywhere where a student in Siberia can get their local certificate and that will be recognised by...
No.
I
That's...
wouldn't go there. It
Yeah.
would be years to go through the Senate.
That's the problem. It's that's where it gets really tricky. I mean, UBC does have joint programs as well, and it did take years to sort of establish those.
See, for one thing, they wouldn't be admitted because they
don't
have to have a
TOEFL
TOEFL score. And they don't
Yeah.
have the TOEFL score. But
Yeah.
because it's asynchronous,
Yeah.
they could in fact get by with help with their other colleagues. And the fact that it's asynchronous is wonderful for second language people because they can use a thesaurus, a dictionary, grammar book, and everything else. But that's what they reported. They reported because it was so intense, it obeyed all the laws of second language acquisition where you're highly motivated and you in fact have control and you're talking about things of high interest. And so that's why they reported they learned so much academic English as a second language during the course. I mean, I teach that area of second language acquisition. And I actually taught for 20 years in a second language myself. I mean, where it was my second language. So I'm familiar with those.
How might you see it working in subject contexts outside of English as a second language? Say, for example, you mentioned a little bit about medical applications. What about trade and technical?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I actually work with a trades program at a college here. And they actually purchased all their content from a provider in Australia. So it's automotive trades. And automotive content is a global sort of topic. I mean, the cars aren't cars. And so in that sense, I mean, the OER part of that is very much relevant. In this case, the content, the global nature of the content is, you know, there's not a real need to localize that. So in that case, I mean, I think really, you know, it's more suited to some things than others. Like I think where there's an opportunity, where multiple perspectives are really needed, and where, for example, with the pandemics, I think one of the examples you gave at one point was, you know, when you have when you need to generate a global response to something like swine flu, you can't have one country sort of telling the world how they need to localize that response. You need to have multiple perspectives on that. So in some cases, there's more of a case for doing it than for others. And the trades, I'm not so sure. Like I think, you know, the content maybe, but the
for the trades it would be relevant because, like, for example, the building code, believe it or not, is different in Victoria than it is in Vancouver. I mean, it's just incredibly complex all across Canada, let alone the United States. So it would be an example where you'd have to locally interpret.
Perhaps, yeah.
My thoughts were that perhaps there's an opportunity aligning with the skilled migrant programs. I'm not sure if Canada has it, but New Zealand, we cry out for particular trades, and we rely on immigration perhaps to fill those trades, and maybe education could play a role in streamlining that process.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Another area might be to talk to Catherine, our keynote speaker this morning, and look at how you could get various African universities involved in something like this. But I think the biggest thing, as I said before, I don't think we can afford just to leave the developing countries on their own. We really have to go in and help them wherever we can to realize their potential. Because for a whole variety of reasons, economic collaboration, but pandemics, everything else, you have to greatly increase the education level of all of the population of the world. And it has to be totally much more integrated. I don't think this idea of one country against another, you know, if we're going to survive global warming, which, anyway, you know, I mean, we're going to have a tremendous amount of technical and scientific knowledge implemented at every level.
I think it's a noble vision, even if you weren't subscribing to the very dire consequences, just without those, it's good enough to keep that perspective. But we may as well, the questions seem to be thinning, so we may finish a minute earlier. If that's Thank you very much, Tannis.
Thank you.